Okay, we continue on with the overview of the content of the Psychology of Quality of Life, which is essentially a book that I authored. My name is Joseph Sergi, and uh, and so far what we've done is talked about a lot of things, and we're up to again we're in the midst of talking about objective reality and its effects on happiness. And in that context, we're talking about the economic effects on personal happiness, the political effects on happiness, sociocultural effects, and now we're at the stage of talking about the effects of demographics. Demographics. So, what are the demographic effects on happiness, like age, gender, education, religious affiliation, minority status, and the like? Uh, the vast majority of uh, large scale surveys using quality of life metrics definitely have demographic variables. Again, those variables are very common, and therefore, because of this, we have a huge amount of data dealing with, or at least exploring the relationship between those demographic variables and subjective well-being, or metrics of which might call hedonic well-being, life satisfaction, eudaimonia, that kind of thing. Okay, well, having said that, again, we're in the midst of talking about now the effects of demographics, and the first slide focuses on the effects of age, the effects of gender, the effects of marital status, family composition, and family life cycle. Let's focus on age. What kind of evidence do we have between age and happiness? Do people, as they age, do they become happier or do they become less happy? What is the relationship? Well, it's kind of interesting that many of the large scale surveys have documented what you call a U-shaped relationship. That means in the early stages of life, it goes from it goes up to adolescence and in young maturity. Um, the relationship is high in the sense that those people in the younger age brackets tend to report higher levels of subjective well-being than those people who are in the middle maturity. We're talking about essentially in from their late 20s all the way up to 50s. So these people in that age bracket, they report lower levels of subjective well-being, and then it starts moving back up in the late 50s and the 60s and in the 70s, up to a point when again people become too aged, and then things start going downhill. But there is, in essence, what you call a U-shaped relationship, in the sense that in the latter years, you see an increase in subjective well-being. So this has sort of created quite an interesting debate, within the scientific community, those experts that study the effects of demographics on happiness. And um, apparently, apparently, again, given the debate, there is one specific um, sets of studies that I want to allude to that um, have been discussed by developmental psychologists. Um, so we're looking at one particular study that sort of captured much of the discourse among developmental psychologists dealing with the relationship between age and subjective well-being. And let me read to you what there is one particular study that advanced the positivity and the maturity principles in the literature of personality and social psychology. The argument is that positive affect remains stable from young to middle adulthood, increasing slightly in adulthood, then slightly decreasing in old age. In contrast, negative affect decreases from young to middle adulthood and leveling off in old age. Correspondingly, life satisfaction increases from young adulthood to middle life, reaching a peak at about 65 and then declining in old age. Conversely, depression decreases from young adulthood to middle adulthood, but then increases in old age. This is essentially what is called the positivity principle, the experience that pleasant affect increases while unpleasant affect decreases across adulthood. Now, in contrast, you got the maturity principle. And the maturity principle says across the lifespan, we see increases in agreeableness and conscientiousness. Narcissism decreases from young adulthood to middle life. Then lifespan trajectories reflect growth of maturity with increasing age. So maturity occurs because psychologically adaptive emotions generally increase with age, and conversely, maladaptive emotions decrease with age. And that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, so again, what we're looking at is a sort of a distinction between hedonic well-being and life satisfaction. And this is the second bullet on that slide, and 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 this discussion captures that distinction between these two constructs. Okay, let's focus now on gender. And the question is that do women experience high levels of well-being than men, or is it vice versa? And the answer to that, based on many, many studies, we've got a huge, again, huge amount of data that speaks to this relationship. And the vast majority of the studies point to the fact that females do experience higher levels of well-being, but on the other hand, they also experience high levels of ill-being. So they experience both, positive affect as well as negative affect, much more so than men. But wait a minute, there there seems to be also moderator effects in terms of age and country. But what do we mean by that? But before we get into that, let me sort of give you an explanation of why is that. The evidence suggests that this may be due to satisfaction in two important life domains, financial and family life. At the beginning of the family life cycle, women are more satisfied with both their financial and family lives. Their aspirational goals for material goods like house, car, travel abroad, and vacation home, and being married and having children are realized early on. However, men's aspirational material and family goals tend to be delayed. They experience more fulfillment in these two domains later in life. This may account for the finding that men to report higher levels of happiness in later stages of the family life cycle than women, while the reverse is true for women. So again, this is a moderation effect of age, in the sense that there is a difference between men and women in the way they report their happiness, and it varies in age. That women tend to experience higher levels of well-being younger ages, while men experience again higher level of well-beings while they're slightly older. But there's also a moderator effect, which is a country effect. Um, for example, women tend to be happy in the United States, while the opposite is true in Russia. Men are happier than women in Russia. Apparently, that may be, that may be a country effect, in the sense that in Russia, women hold low status in Russia than in the United States. So in some countries, um, depending on how women are viewed by society at large, whether they have high status or low status, again, that may moderate the relationship in which they may experience certain levels of well-being. So again, in countries in which they are viewed as having low status, then of course women are likely to experience low levels of subjective well-being than men, and vice versa. Okay, well, let's move on and talk about the effects of marital status, family composition, and family life cycle. Is there a an effect between, is there a difference between married versus unmarried um, people in terms of their subjective level, their subjective well-being? And the answer is yes. There seems to be quite a bit of difference, meaning that people, married persons, report higher levels of subjective well-being than those people who are not married. And the explanation is that those people who are married, they have higher levels of social support. That marriage has what you might call a stress buffering effect. They experience feelings of belonging. They have a purpose. But wait a minute, that assumes that the marriage is a happy marriage. So research suggests that those who are not happily married are likely to report physical health problems and psychological difficulties, and thus lower levels of well-being. But then the question is that, does this effect last? And of course, the only way that you can actually check on that is through longitudinal research. And we have one particular study that found no support for the notion that happiness increases after marriage. The finding shows that this effect may be short-lived, and eventually people go back to their baseline of happiness, their set point that they may have experienced or they may have had before marriage. Um, so again, yes, marriage seems to have an effect, but the effect seems to maybe be short-lived, because whatever set point of happiness that people have, the honeymoon, so to speak, dissipates and people go back to their set point. Well, at least that's what the evidence suggests at this point. How about widowhood? Apparently, when people become widowed, um, they do experience quite a bit of um, distress, and that distress, um, not a lot of people recover from that level of distress because of the loss of loved one that easily. So Again, the evidence suggests that widows do not fully recover after after the death of a spouse, and so it plummets. Subjective well-being plummets, and but it recovers a little bit, but it doesn't come back to the the original degree of happiness um, before the death of the spouse. And I guess that makes sense if you think about it, at least intuitively. How about divorce? Divorce, people who go through divorce experience a high level of emotional turmoil. They experience depression, hostility, and loneliness. But the good news is that the negative effects tend to be short lived, and people go back to, their set point of happiness. So divorce does take a toll on people's subjective well-being, but again, it doesn't last. At least that's what the evidence suggests. How about having children? Well, this is an area that has quite a bit of conflicting evidence. If you have children, does having children increase your personal happiness or does it decrease it? And again, the research suggests, well, some studies show yes, it does. Some studies show no. Some studies do not show any kind of evidence. So again, the jury's still out on the effect of having children on subjective well-being. How about parental divorce? Does when an adolescent or when a child goes through having parents going through divorce, does that affect their subjective well-being? And absolutely, the evidence suggests that parental divorce does have a lingering effect on children's well-being. Let me read to you this one particular paragraph. Parental divorce seems to be associated with a host of negative adult outcomes, including low subjective well being, more behavioral problems, less education, lower job status, lower standard of living, lower marital satisfaction, heightened risk of divorce, heightened risk of being a single parent, poor physical health, and violence. Wow. Well, that's a mouthful. That's a lot of negativity there. So again, yeah, this is what the evidence is suggesting in terms of parental divorce does indeed have negative effects on subjective well-being of the children of the divorced parents, right? Okay. Well, let's move on to the second slide. And the second slide focuses on the effects of education and work-related demographics, the effects of community-related demographics, the effects of ethnicity and minority status, and religious affiliation. Well, let's talk about those. How about education? I mean, intuitively you think that, for those people who are more educated, they would experience a high level of happiness. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. The evidence suggests that is a little bit conflicting. Um, and the explanation seems to be what you call a double-edged sword, in the sense that yes, education helps people achieve life goals, and therefore, intuitively, achieving those life goals would help people become more satisfied with life. But the double-edged sword says that when people become more educated and they become more successful, what happens is that um, their their aspirations changes and increase as a function of their education. So they expect more out of life, and if they don't achieve the kind of things that they aspired to achieve, then they feel dissatisfied with life. So education creates aspiration, and if they are achieved, then they become happy. If they're not achieved, then they become dissatisfied with life. That seems to be the uh, the accepted explanation, yeah, among quality of life researchers. Okay, moving right along, the effects of work-related demographics. Here, what we're doing is we're looking at the type of work, like occupational prestige. How about the work status category, like full-time versus part-time employment, self-employment, commuting time to and from work. Focusing on the type of work, that means certain kinds of occupation um, tend to be associated with prestige, occupational prestige. If you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, that carries quite a bit of prestige with it compared to, let's say, if you're a janitor, for example. Um, uh, so that occupational prestige if affects subjective well-being. So those people who occupy those positions that have high level of prestige, again, that prestige, that status that is imbued in the position spills over to life satisfaction, and that that seems to be evident. Work status categories, those people who uh, have full-time employment versus part-time employment. Well, those people who have full-time employment tend to experience a higher level of subjective well-being than those people who have part-time employment. But wait a minute, this effect is moderated by gender, meaning that women who are who have part-time jobs do not experience lower level of subjective well-being because of the part-time employment. So apparently this relationship holds only for men, not women. How about self-employment? Apparently self-employment carries with it a certain amount of occupational prestige. So those people who are self-employed tend to feel higher levels of subjective well-being than those people who, are employed in traditional companies or traditional organizations of all kinds. Um, and I guess self-employment gives people a sense of autonomy, and that sense of autonomy and purpose also um, uh, helps with subjective well-being. It contributes to subjective well-being. Another set of studies have focused on commuting back and forth between work and home, and the obvious, I guess, the most obvious and intuitive result that seems to come out of those studies is that those people who have a longer commute tend to experience lower levels of subjective well-being than those people who have a short commute. And I guess the traffic and fighting traffic seems to take a toll, an emotional toll on people that really spills over in different life domains and ultimately subjective well-being or life satisfaction at large. Okay, effects of community-related demographics. What are those? Well, here we have the size of the community. Um, and and it's kind of interesting for those people who live in communities that seem to be large, uh, you know, their objective quality of life. So if you measure a quality of life from an objective perspective, as in terms of economic well-being, health well-being, and so forth, versus asking them how happy they are. These are the subjective indicators of quality of life. There seems to be a difference, and that is uh, the larger the community, the more objective, the higher level of objective quality of life uh, But when it comes to subjective indicators of quality of life, i.e., personal happiness, that's exactly the reverse. So the larger the size of the community, the more people express lower levels of subjective well-being. And I think when it comes to, you know, this may be explained by social capital. In smaller communities, people know each other. There's a lot more social support in a smaller community than a larger community. People becomes almost anonymous in a larger community, and they don't have any sense of social connectedness, belongingness to the community. Although from an objective perspective, they may have better health, they may have better this and that, and the reason being in larger communities, the the amenities are there. There's all kinds of government services, there are all kinds of business services, and again, these provide the kinds of um, the kinds of goods and services that allow people to prosper. So that's why you end up with the distinction between objective and subjective indicators when it comes to the size of the community. How about urbanization? Again, that is a sort of an offshoot of the first point, which is the size of the community. And that is the more the place is urbanized, well, some studies show that there is a positive effect, and other studies show a negative effect. Other studies show no effect. Again, the jury's still out on that. The effects of ethnicity and minority status. How about that? Well, again, the vast majority of the studies, especially conducted in the United States, show that minorities like American Indians and and uh, Af- African Americans as well as Hispanics tend to report lower levels of subjective well-being than the white majority. And a lot of people in quality of life research, what they do is they point to discrimination and prejudice that is leveled against those minority as an explanation of that negative effect. That's just, that stigma is associated with belonging to a certain minority group and how they're treated within society that may account for that effect. But again, this is the United States. So if you go to places like Russia, well, in Russia, again, that effect is not there. Minorities in Russia um, do not experience lower levels of subjective well-being than other than the majority people. So again, it depends on the country and the cultural context. Um, Finally, you look at the effects of religious affiliation, whether you are affiliated with a specific religion, a specific church, let's say within Christianity, whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant or if you're Jewish or you're a Muslim, if you're affiliated with a specific religious organization, whatever the organization, whatever the religion is, again, if you are affiliated with some sort of a religious organization, it's likely that you'll feel happier. And again, the explanation is that there is fellowship. If you belong to a religious organization, a church or a mosque, then there's a great deal of social capital that translates into subjective well-being. And that seems to be, again, a common and a well-accepted explanation for the effect of religious affiliation on subjective well-being. Okay, I think we're done dealing with the demographic effects on happiness. So that's the end of this module.